Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, all members shall have 5 legislative days with which to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. A quorum being present, we'll now proceed to today's business. Before we begin, I'd like to call the attention to the markup notice, which instructs that 100 copies of amendments must be provided before an amendment is read for consideration. If enough copies are not available, I'll ask that the sponsor withdraw the amendment until the sponsor has sufficient copies. Now, let me recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning. During our past 5 months of the 119th Congress, this committee has been hard at work examining solutions to improve the quality and condition of financial regulation to empower access to capital for American businesses, both large and small. Today, we'll continue that work by marking up several bills to strengthen community banking in America, relieve small businesses from the strain of harmful regulation, and expand access to capital, and more. Before we get started, I'd like to address an issue Ranking Member Waters raised with me regarding the majority not meeting our timelines for ensuring that amendments are available to the public within 24 hours of a markup. She's correct. We had an inadvertent administrative mistake that was made. Members should have the maximum amount of time to review text prior to a markup. The committee works best when we work together in a transparent way. And just like my comment of a few minutes ago about making sure that we have adequate numbers of amendment copies for the debate, we had an issue on that in our prior markup, and I know that Ranking Member Waters and I are committed to timely and adequate notice. Moving forward, I've directed my staff to be extra diligent in meeting committee deadlines to ensure this mistake will not turn into any kind of a trend. I appreciate Ranking Member Waters and her staff working with us on several of the bipartisan priorities that are before the committee today. With that, let's get started. Last November, I released a set of principles called Making Community Banking Great Again. I'm pleased that some of these ideas have come to life in the form of important legislation that we're considering today. Bills such as my Fair Exams Act, which boosts the transparency in bank exams, sets clear timelines, and establishes an independent supervisory appeals process for disputes. We'll also consider the Financial Integrity and Regulation Management Act, FIRM Act, which aims to prevent politicization of bank supervision and ensure regulatory focus remains on material risks related to safety and soundness. We'll also consider the Bank Failure Prevention Act, which ensures timely decisions on bank mergers by defining when applications are complete and setting deadlines for their review. Mr. Barr is doing a fine job in leading our Financial Institutions Subcommittee, and I'm pleased to see that work being highlighted today in the work of his subcommittee members. We've all heard and seen firsthand how important access to capital is. It fuels growth, innovation, and opportunity across our country. That's why we're considering several bills from the Capital Markets Subcommittee, ably chaired by Mrs. Wagner. Many of these bills are bipartisan, and we've worked with the ranking member, her staff, and members across the aisle to achieve that process. One of Chair Wagner's bill, the Increasing Investor Opportunities Act, will expand the ability of closed-end funds to invest in private markets, providing everyday investors with more ways to diversify their portfolios and access well-regulated and high-growth opportunities. Every bill under consideration today is aimed at strengthening our economy, supporting American consumers and businesses, and ensuring that our banking and capital market system, especially our community banks, remain strong. Today is an opportunity to ensure that the United States remains the global leader in financial innovation and opportunity. I look forward to taking the first step to move these common sense bills forward, and I yield back. I now recognize the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Since the last time this full committee convened, economic conditions for our nation's consumers and investors have grown even worse, and this is due entirely to the harmful policies of Donald Trump. American families are facing mounting economic anxiety and uncertainty about their future, and their economic outlook is grim, evoking painful memories from the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2008 financial crisis. Families are putting major decisions on hold, like starting a family, buying a car, or taking the first steps toward achieving the American dream by purchasing a home. Not to mention, small businesses are worried about whether they'll have to close. These concerns have grown following Trump's declaration that there will be more tariffs to come. What's more, the dollar is down and yields are up. This means higher costs for families. And on Friday, Moody's downgraded the United States credit rating because of the damaging effects of Trump's tariff policies and concerns about the government's existing debt levels. If Republicans pass their tax scam bill, they will hand trillions of dollars in tax breaks to the likes of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, while raising costs for families by slashing Medicaid, food stamps, and dismantling important regulators like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. America's lowered credit rating will drive up costs even more. Let's face it, this isn't the golden age Trump and Republicans promised. This is the Trump slump. And while Trump and his insiders don't feel the pain, my constituents do. I and Democrats on the committee have long sought to pass legislation to support small businesses, from setting aside $60 billion for small lenders to lend to the smallest of businesses during the pandemic, to $12 billion for community development, financial institutions, and minority banks and credit unions. Those measures were bipartisan. In fact, I negotiated both of those deals with Trump's first Treasury Secretary. And today, Democrats will again work with the opposite side of the aisle and show that we will support any bills this committee can offer to help small businesses, especially as they are burdened by Trump's economic policies. Nevertheless, it is disappointing that none of these bills before us address this economic crisis. Instead, committee Republicans are proposing bills that will strip retirement savings from hardworking teachers and healthcare workers and weaken investor protection, even while Trump continues to undermine our markets with his crypto scams. If this committee won't take on Trump, we can at least pass legislation to help community banks and credit unions. But the bills before us today just missed the mark. I implore the chairman to engage with Democrats on his community bank agenda. There are dozens of Democratic bills that have enjoyed broad bipartisan support in previous years that should be considered in any community bank package. We have bills that support community development, financial institutions, and bills that finally respond to the Silicon Valley Bank failure 2 years ago. So I hope the chairman will work with us on this topic going forward. Let me be clear. Democrats want to rebuild the economy and clean up the mess created by Trump. But we cannot do that if Republicans are too afraid to acknowledge that there is a crisis. In the meantime, Democrats will continue fighting for legislation that ends consumer ripoffs, strengthens the banking system, protects the hard-earned savings our retirees, supports small businesses, and shields investors from scams, especially at the hands of the President of the United States. And so, I hope our Republican colleagues can muster the courage to join us. And I would like to thank the chairman today for explaining that sometimes we have a few difficulties as it relates to procedure, but he has apologized. I accept his apology, and I will work with him on those kinds of issues. Thank you so very much, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Appreciate her opening statement. Pursuant to the notice, I call up H.R. 3394, the Fair Investment Opportunities for Professional Experts Act, which I introduced. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3394, to amend the Securities Act of 1933 to codify certain qualifications of individuals as accredited investors for purposes of the securities laws.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any time. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance, and the clerk will report that amendment.
an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3394, offered by Mr. Hill of Arkansas, designated as Hill AR_28.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as the base text for the purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'm proud to offer this bill, H.R. 3394, the Fair Investment Opportunities for Professional Experts Act, which I've introduced along with the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas. For far too long, the federal government has relied on the arbitrary wealth threshold to determine who can and cannot participate in a private investment opportunity. Under the current definition of an accredited investor, Americans are shut out of these markets unless they meet a narrow financial test, regardless of whether or not they have the expertise, education, or industry knowledge to make an informed decision. This approach, in my view, is outdated. This bill would correct that. It directs the SEC to broaden the definition of an accredited investor to include individuals who can demonstrate professional expertise, relevant education, or similar credentials. The goal is simple. If someone has the knowledge to understand the risks and merits of a private offering, they ought to be allowed to invest regardless of whether or not they meet a government-imposed income or net worth test. In practice, this means a doctor could invest in a telehealth startup. A farmer could participate in an agricultural venture, so long as they demonstrate a strong understanding of the opportunity based on their professional experience and credentials. It's about aligning access with capability, not just with capital. And I've seen this firsthand. In the years before my election to Congress, I helped start up management teams raise capital through Reg D private placements. The strict definition and associate liability was a real hindrance to the knowledge of worthy potential investors. Expanding accredited investor eligibility is also a win for small businesses and startups across Arkansas and across our nation. These are the job creators and the innovators who often rely on private capital to grow, but they're often too limited by this narrow pool of investors. This bill opens the door to a broader, more diverse base of capital, helping entrepreneurs raise funds and expand opportunity. It's a common sense bill. It's a bipartisan reform that we've introduced in the past Congresses, and I'm glad this committee is once again considering it. The SEC has the tools to implement this in a thoughtful, measured way, and this legislation gives them clear direction to do so. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time. Who seeks recognition? My friend, Mr. Vargas from California, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I want to thank the ranking member. I would like to speak in support of H.R. 3394, the Fair Investment Opportunities for Professional Experts Act, which I am proud to co-lead with yourself, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking both the chairman and the ranking member for their work on their issue, and especially their staffs. They've been excellent to work with, and my staff has appreciated that very much. Thank you. Under the current law, the requirements to become an accredited investor mainly focus on income level and the net worth thresholds. That means that with limited exceptions, only those who make $200,000 a year or $300,000 with a spouse, or who have a net worth of $1 million excluding a primary residence, can qualify as an accredited investor. But as many of my colleagues have said in the past, wealth does not equal knowledge. By expanding the definition to include well-informed Americans who may not come from affluence, our bill makes it so that you don't have to start wealthy to participate in the private markets. It allows those with relevant qualifications and credentials, such as an MBA, to become accredited investors. Additionally, this bill makes a common sense fix to the existing definition by indexing both the income and the net worth thresholds to inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. And this legislation does more than just allow knowledgeable Americans from middle and lower incomes communities to participate in these markets. By responsibly increasing the pool of investors, this bill will also improve the ability of small businesses who may not otherwise have access to huge investors to raise capital and grow their businesses. Again, I appreciate the chairman's introduction of this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentlewoman from Missouri.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairman, the ranking member, and of course, the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, for their work on this bill, which modernizes the outdated accredited investor definition and expands the pool of individuals who qualify as accredited investors. This bill will allow Americans to use their education and expertise to diversify and maximize the growth of their investments, while also creating additional funding opportunities for entrepreneurs. Expanding the accredited investor definition and allowing more investors to participate in private offerings is essential for the growth and the prosperity of our economy. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee. She yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
While I do have, lingering concerns about the reduced capacity of the SEC to do its job because of funding and staffing reductions, I do have to say, Mr. Hill, that, Mr. Chairman, that the bill you present with Mr. Vargas is prudent. I think it's narrowly tailored. I agree with the premise of the bill that there are plenty of examples of expertise that go far beyond net worth that should grant accredited investor status. And I think that's what your bill does, and I'm happy to support it for that reason. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Downing, recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I started out in the private sector as an issuer. We did almost exclusively alternative investments, Regulation D investments, and I found at that time that the restrictions on who could invest were fundamentally unfair, and I found them to be un-American. Today's accredited investor standard too often treats investment access as a privilege for the wealthy, not as a right earned through expertise. The current accredited investor standard limits investments in the private markets to those with an annual income of at least $200,000 or a net worth of over $1 million, has already been discussed here. For context, the median household income in Montana is nearly $71,000, with only 8% of households making $200,000 or more. So on one hand, you could inherit $1 million, have no experience, no idea what you're doing, and be considered an accredited investor with unlimited access to the private markets. Or on the other hand, you could have a PhD in economics, a $100,000 salary, and be blocked from the private markets your entire life. So how is that fair? Not only are you denying non-public companies access to capital, you're denying everyday investors growth in their retirement accounts. That is why I am supporting H.R. 3394, the Fair Investment Opportunities for Professional Experts Act, sponsored by Chairman Hill. This bipartisan legislation corrects this imbalance by allowing individuals with relevant education, credentials, or job experience to qualify as accredited investors. It recognizes that professional knowledge, not net worth, is a legitimate foundation for assessing risk and opportunity. It strengthens capital formation and expands the investor base without sacrificing investor protections. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense legislation, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Ranking member is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill. I want to just go back to some of the history of how we got to the point of the definition of accredited investor. The accredited investor framework, which is being changed by this and other bills today, has long protected the general public from investing in high-risk, illiquid, private securities. Unlike our public capital markets, in the private capital markets, companies do not provide anywhere near the same financial and other disclosures to investors, and there are not the same legal protections for investors either, nor is it they're the same ability of the SEC or the state securities regulators to police these markets. Now, During the Reagan administration, the SEC decided to deregulate rules around companies' ability to raise funds from institutional or otherwise very wealthy investors through unregistered securities. The theory was that institutional investors like pensions funds, banks, or university endowments don't necessarily need the same level of protection when investing in unregistered securities that retail investors like working families do. This is when the Accredited Investor Framework was created to regulate how brokers could sell these unregistered securities to investors. Initially, accredited investors were thought to be those who possess an intimate understanding of the risk and had the knowledge base to decide whether to invest in these particular types of securities. But industry argued for a simpler approach, so the SEC adopted the current definition. Today, to be an accredited investor, the investor must have a net worth, either individually or with a spouse, exceeding $1 million or excluding the value of their home, make more than $200,000 a year or $300,000 with a spouse, or hold certain professional certifications or designations, such as being an investment advisor or broker. These wealth and income thresholds were set in 1983. Back then, roughly 2% of all American households qualified as accredited, and as of 2023, that number has risen to roughly 20%, or nearly 1 in 5 households. It could become as high as 30%, or roughly 1 in 3 households in the next decade. Mr. Hill's bill, and this is Mr. Hill's bill, and the co-author on this bill is Mr. Vargas, and so you have bipartisan support here, restates Congress' intent that the SEC needs to adjust the income and wealth threshold to adjust for inflation, and importantly, the bill aims to return back to the original concept of accredited investor, which is that investors in these high-risk investment officers should be fully aware and knowledgeable of the risk involved. We all know that just because you have $1 million, it doesn't mean you understand the complexities of the private markets. This is why it's so important for the SEC to update the definition of accredited investors, protect investors. And so, let's see what has happened here. Those who do not have the information or knowledge about the risk of these unregistered products to be solicited for investments. Conversely, you should not be prohibited from investing in products if you have full knowledge of the risk involved, but don't happen to have $1 million. All of this brings me to Chairman Hill's bill again. It says individuals with certain credentials, such as someone perhaps with a master's in business administration or a FINRA certification, for example, should be deemed accredited without needing to meet the income or wealth requirements. I'm under no illusion about whatever the risk may be of these products and how they're sold, but I think our time would be better spent protecting those who don't have the knowledge or information from being solicited in these investors, even if they have financial wherewithal, and allow those who understand the risk, who have the expertise or knowledge to invest in these risky products. Let me just say that I agreed wholeheartedly that something had to be done, that you could not just be considered, having wealth of $1 million or up to $300 million or whatever, that even those with a lot less money and maybe more knowledge, or even just want to take some risk, should be able to do that. So I'm a proud supporter of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Hearing none, we'll move to amendments. Does anyone wish to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. An amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
May I request a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman?
A gentlewoman has requested a recorded vote. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hands. Sufficient number having raised their hand, a recorded vote is so ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, a vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move on to the next bill. Pursuant, I call up H.R. 3381, the Encouraging Public Offerings Act of 2025, introduced by the gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, the chair of our Capital Markets Subcommittee. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3381 to amend the Securities Act of 1933 to expand the ability to use testing the waters and confidential draft registration submissions and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentlewoman from Missouri has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3381 offered by Ms. Wagner of Missouri, designated as Wagner 015.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of the amendment. Gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. My bill, H.R. 3381, the Encouraging Public Offerings Act, would allow an issuer to communicate or test the waters with potential investors to determine interest in the securities offering, either before or after the filing of a registration statement. This bill will encourage more companies to go public and provide better information to investors by expanding on the popular provisions of the Jobs Act. The Encouraging Public Offerings Act ensures that all companies, rather than just emerging growth companies, are allowed to test the waters. This bill will make listing on exchanges more attractive, strengthening our financial markets and providing Main Street investors with more opportunities to save for their retirement and to grow their nest eggs. I want to thank Mr. Meeks in particular for his continued support of this legislation. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Strike last word. As someone who believes deeply in the power of transparent, well-regulated markets to drive inclusive economic growth, I strongly support H.R. 3381, the Encouraging Public Officers Act of 2025. This bill takes meaningful steps to modernize the IPO process and reduce unnecessary friction for companies considering going public while still preserving key investor protections. By allowing more companies to test the waters with institutional investors before filing publicly, we create an environment that fosters into innovation, job creation, and capital formation, especially for smaller, high-growth firms that too often face barriers to entering public markets. Importantly, this bill doesn't weaken our disclosure standards or oversight. It simply gives companies more flexibility early in the process, helping them make better informed decisions without compromising transparency once they go public. So I want to thank Chairwoman Wagner for her work and for working with me on this balanced, bipartisan effort to strengthen our markets, and I urge all my colleagues to support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Meeks yields back. Who seeks recognition? Ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Recognized for
Chairman.
5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
This bill codifies an SEC rule that allows any issuer to submit a confidential draft of their registration statement for non-public review. Doing so will allow all issuers to more carefully craft their registration statements under SEC's watchful eyes. This bill also codifies a 2019 SEC rulemaking that allows any issuer to test the waters before going public. In other words, any issuer can now gauge interest in their bill offering by talking to certain institutional investors without first needing to file a registration statement. Overall, this makes it easier for companies to access our capital markets and go public. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the bill.
The gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank Chairwoman Wagner for introducing H.R. 3381, the Encouraging Public Offerings Act, introduced under her able leadership with Ranking Member Meeks, with her Democratic colleague, Rick Meeks. This bipartisan bill encourages capital formation by making initial public offerings more attractive for companies, while also enhancing market transparency to better protect investors. H.R. 3381 would allow any issuer to communicate with potential investors to gauge interest in a securities offering either before or after the filing of a registration statement. This is called testing the waters. It permits an issuer to submit confidential draft registration statement for review prior to a public filing. This bill will also maintain the continued uniformity in registration process for emerging growth companies and non-emerging growth companies by ensuring that any issuer can continue to file confidential draft registration statements and test the waters either before or after an offering. It provides greater certainty by tying the date that a registration statement needs to be filed publicly to the date of effectiveness rather than the date of a roadshow. H.R. 3381 is a prime example of the committee's efforts to modernize regulations and support job creators. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment of nature substitute? There being no further amendments, without objection, the previous question on the substitute is ordered and recorded votes on the pending amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, amendment now is the adoption of amendment of nature substitute offered by the gentlewoman from Missouri. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill H.R. 3381 as amendment reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall be signified by saying nay. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentlewoman.
I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. That vote is postponed. We'll now move on for consideration of the next bill. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3422, the Promoting Opportunities for Non-Traditional Capital Formation Act, introduced by the gentlewoman from California, the ranking member of the full committee, Mrs. Waters. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3422 to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to require the advocate for small business capital formation to provide educational resources and host events to promote capital raising options for traditional underrepresented small businesses and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentlewoman from California has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3422, offered by Ms. Waters of California, designated as Waters 063.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read, will serve as the base text for purposes of amendment. The ranking member, Mrs. Waters, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
The Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation is an independent SEC office that was established to advance the interests of small businesses. The office proactively works to identify and address unique challenges faced by minority-owned, women-owned, and rural small businesses, as well as businesses located in natural disaster areas. My bill requires the SEC Small Business Advocate to provide educational resources and host events to promote capital raising options for those underrepresented small businesses. My bill would also require the office to meet annually with representatives of state securities commissions and to ensure that there is a whole-of-government approach to addressing the unique needs of underrepresented businesses. The North American Securities Administrators Association, or the NASAA, strongly supports this legislation, particularly as it would, quote, strengthen collaboration and coordination between regulators, quote, unquote. In a letter to my office written in support of this bill, when it was previously introduced, NASAA emphasized SEC Commissioner Michael Pivovar's comments that, quote, for a capital formation agenda to succeed, it is essential that state and federal regulators work together to support the businesses that seek to engage in these offerings while protecting investors, quote unquote. Indeed, my bill makes sure that federal regulators and state regulators do just that, while at the same time advancing the cause of small business capital formation across the spectrum. I'd like to thank Ms. Wagner for co-sponsoring my bill and hope my colleagues will join us in passing this bill into law. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank Ranking Member Waters, Mrs. Wagner, for working together and offering this legislation, and for her, Mrs. Waters' particular focus on small business capital formation. Entrepreneurs and founders should raise money with as little friction as possible. However, access to funding is not evenly distributed across our country. I certainly recognize that in my home state of Arkansas. For example, most venture capital funding goes to companies in just 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York. As a result, Congress should take steps to provide companies and entrepreneurs from all geographic regions with access to the resources they need to grow. This bill would require the SEC's Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation, known as the Advocate, to provide educational resources and host events to promote capital raising options for underrepresented small businesses and other businesses, particularly in rural areas. By requiring the advocate to provide educational resources and host events to promote capital raising options for underserved entrepreneurs, this bill will empower entrepreneurs throughout the country to use the most effective capital raising provisions based on their unique needs and circumstances. I appreciate Ranking Member Waters' attention to this issue, and I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back. Who seeks recognition? Hearing none, we'll move on to amendments. Are there amendments to Mrs. Waters' amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill, H.R. 3422, as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Recorded vote is requested.
What purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Recorded vote is requested.
A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, a vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move on to the next bill. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3351, the Improving Access to Small Business Information Act, introduced by the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Kemp. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3351, to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to specify that actions of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation are not a collection of information under the Paperwork Reduction Act.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentlewoman from California has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance. The clerk will now report the amendment.
an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3351 offered by Ms. Kim of California, designated as Kim CA_033.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of amendment. The gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Kim, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hill and Ranking Member Waters, for holding this important markup. I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Representative Gottheimer from New Jersey, for co-leading H.R. 3351, the Improving Access to Small Business Information Act, with me and making it a bipartisan bill. My bill is simple. The legislation would specify that activities like conducting field surveys carried out by the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation are not a collection of information under the Paper Reduction Act. Currently, OMB's approval process is prolonged and bureaucratic, which delays feedback collection from small businesses and their investors. I'm proud to represent Orange County, which is home to over 100,000 small businesses. It takes grit, perseverance, and commitment to start with an idea and make it a reality. As a former small business owner myself, I remember often wondering if the government truly understood the way that its policies impacted small businesses. Former director of the Office of the Advocate, Martha Miller, said that the office went through a year-long process just to collect registration information for our annual forum and ask a few basic questions to understand the audience attending. Our regulations are restricting the government from understanding the needs of small businesses. The SEC's Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation is the primary office charged with advancing the interests of the small businesses and their investors. With the ever-changing economic and regulatory environment, the office must be able to adapt quickly to the needs of small businesses and gather timely feedback to improve policy. H.R. 3351 reduces red tape and streamlines access to tools that the office can utilize to gather more effective and timely data. The better information that the office can gather, the better the SEC can respond, and the better off our small businesses will be. I urge my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to support H.R. 3351. With that, I yield the balance of my time.
Mrs. Kim yields back. Who seeks recognition? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Oh, gentlewoman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word, and I want to thank the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kim, for introducing this bipartisan piece of legislation. This bill ensures that the SEC's Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation doesn't face burdensome bureaucratic red tape in its efforts to promote capital formation and advocate for job creators, entrepreneurs, and their investors. I urge my colleagues to strongly support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Ranking member of the full committee, Mrs. Waters.
I move to strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
The Paperwork Reduction Act mandates that all federal agencies receive approval before putting forth a paper, form, or survey that will impose an information collection burden on the general public. Although well-intended, the Paperwork Reduction Act often prevents federal agencies like the SEC from obtaining data from the public, the very data that assists the agencies in carrying out their missions. This bill streamlines the ability of the SEC Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation to carry out its mission by exempting it from the requirements of that act in the same way that the SEC's Investor Advocate is exempted. In effect, it enables the Small Business Advocate to properly conduct its job, which will only benefit its ability to craft regulation that help small businesses raise capital. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this important bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Seeing none, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to add my voice of strong support to Congresswoman Young Kim's bill, H.R. 3351, the Improving Access to Small Business Information Act. The SEC's Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation plays a vital role in elevating the voices of entrepreneurs and small businesses navigating our capital markets. Each year, the advocate engages directly with business owners across the country to understand the real-world barriers they're facing when raising capital. But outdated red tape gets in the way of that very practical goal. Under current law, the simple outreach, such as conducting surveys or collecting feedback, can trigger the full weight of the Paperwork Reduction Act. That adds unnecessary bureaucracy to what should be a pretty routine engagement. Mrs. Kim's bill provides a practical fix. It clarifies that the advocate's outreach activities are not subject to the Paperwork Reduction Act's requirements, allowing the office to gather input more efficiently and more effectively. By cutting through red tape, this bill strengthens the advocate's ability to shape sound policy rooted in real business experience. I urge my colleagues to support this smart, targeted reform, and I yield back. Does anyone seek to be recognized? Hearing none, we'll move to amendments. Are there amendments to Mrs. Kim's amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill, H.R. 3351, as amended to report it to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair,
Chairman,
the
may I
ayes
ask for a
have it.
recorded vote?
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Chairman, I would like to ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hand, a recorded vote is ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move on to the next bill. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3395, the Middle Market IPO Underwriting Cost Act, introduced by the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3395, to require the Comptroller General of the United States to carry out a study of the costs associated with small and medium-sized companies to undertake initial public offerings.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from Connecticut has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3395, offered by Mr. Himes of Connecticut, designated as Himes_005.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of amendment. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank you and Ranking Member Waters for considering this bill today. The Middle Market IPO Cost Act grows out of a consideration that I had many years ago when we worked on the Jobs Act, which was designed to reduce the costs associated with emerging growth companies going public. At the time, we were not looking at one of the very substantial costs associated with going public. That is the many fees to advisors and others, and in particular, the gross spread that is charged to take a company public. The gross spread is the compensation that underwriters of an IPO receive. Over many years, for middle market companies in particular, the gross spread has held remarkably stable at precisely 7%. According to a 2023 report from the University of Florida, between 2001 and 2022, 95% of U.S. company IPOs that raised between 30 and 130 million in proceeds had a gross spread of 7%. That is pretty much on the face of it, not market behavior. From 1992 to 2017, more than 80% of middle market IPOs, which ranged from 20 to 80 million in proceeds, that's the smallest IPOs, had gross spreads of exactly 7%. That too is not market behavior. The number of IPOs has already declined sharply in recent decades, largely because the process is too costly and complex for all but the largest and most sophisticated firms. The growth of private equity and the resulting availability of capital have also provided an appealing alternative to companies that previously would have had little choice but to go public. The current state of turmoil we are facing in the markets makes for less favorable conditions for going public, even for companies that are interested. The Middle Market IPO Cost Act simply calls for a study to examine the market forces or the lack thereof that drive the growth spread and other costs associated with going public to see if we can understand what drives them and what might be done to try to make that market more competitive and reduce the cost for company trying to access the public markets. I don't need to do arithmetic for anybody in this room, but at 7%, the fee associated with a $200 million IPO is $14 million. For a young company, that is a lot of money. Reducing the cost of IPOs will restore going public as a viable path to capital for small and mid-sized companies and will reinforce America's status as the premier destination for capital formation, not to mention the fact that retail investors will once again have a shot at more companies that they would be excluded from if those companies are financed in the private market. It will support innovation, job creation, and economic diversification. This bill will help enable entrepreneurship, expand access to capital, and ultimately boost the American economy. I'm proud to lead this bipartisan bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Again, thank you to the chairman and to the ranking member for considering this bill today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The ranking member.
Thank you very much. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I support Mr. Himes' bill, which will shed light on how much smaller and medium-sized companies are paying for their underwriting fees to go public. I hope it will finally put pressure on the SEC to address this anti-competitive part of Wall Street. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Seeing none, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank my friend from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, for working for several years on this legislation, working on it in a bipartisan way. Companies have two ways of accessing capital across the country in our securities markets. They can fund their operations through an initial public offering, where they sell securities publicly through a registered offering with the SEC, or they can have a private offering under an exemption from registration. Accessing capital through an IPO is a significant step for a company because there are considerable upfront costs as well as increased costs associated with the company's ongoing reporting requirements after becoming public. Before an IPO, companies spend tens of millions of dollars gathering and compiling mandatory information to submit to the SEC and make available to the public for their consideration prior to the sale of its securities. However, additional data will provide policymakers a better understanding about the added regulatory and professional services costs associated with undertaking an IPO. As a result, the study required by Mr. Himes' bill will help Congress and the market better understand the costs associated with small and medium-sized companies going public through the IPO process. It's a common-sense, data-based proposal that will support the committee's broader efforts at strengthening our public markets and promoting capital formation. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back. Does anyone seek recognition? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill H.R. 3395 as amended reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Mrs. Wagner.
I request to record a vote.
Gentleman from Missouri requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, a vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move to our next measure. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3343, the Green Lighting Growth Act, introduced by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Herodopoulos. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3343, to amend the federal securities laws to specify the periods for which financial statements are required to be provided by an emerging growth company and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from Florida has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3343, offered by Mr. Herodopoulos of Florida, designated as Harry Doe _006.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of the amendment. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Herodopoulos, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, I'm proud to present my first bill as a new member of Congress, H.R. 3343, the Greenlighting Growth Act. It is a targeted reform that sends a clear signal that Congress stands with America's small businesses, entrepreneurs, and job creators. The Greenlighting Growth Act strengthens and clarifies the promise of the Bipartisan Jobs Act of 2012, which created the Emerging Growth Company designation. That designation allowed smaller, high-growth companies to go public under streamlined SEC filing requirements, including a reduced 2-year window for audited financial statements. These companies are vital to our economy. These companies create jobs, attract investment, and fuel the next generation of American innovation. And the Jobs Act worked. As the most recent count showed, nearly 17% of publicly listed companies qualified as emerging growth companies. But today, those benefits can vanish when a company tries to expand through an acquisition. The SEC can impose additional burdensome filing requirements going against what the Jobs Act created. That would mean higher costs, regulatory uncertainty, and a penalty for doing exactly what we want them to do, grow. This Greenlighting Growth Act fixes those concerns. The bill ensures that EGCs and companies that went public don't face surprise financial disclosure burdens when acquiring another company. It simply makes the rules clear, consistent, and growth-friendly. Congress was right in 2012. Emerging growth companies are an engine for innovation and job creation across our nation. This targeted legislation removes the roadblocks and sends a clear message that we're committed to smart reforms that reward innovation, fuel growth, and keep America the best place in the world to start and scale a business. I respectfully urge this committee to report this bill favorably to the House. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Mrs. Wagner of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Herodopoulos, for introducing this important bill. This bill provides clarity for emerging growth companies, EGCs, by ensuring that companies that have gone public under EGC disclosure requirements only need to provide 2 years of audited financial statements. Under the Jobs Act of 2012, EGC status was created as an on-ramp for companies looking to pursue an IPO, but that were weary of the burdensome reporting requirements that an IPO would traditionally entail. One particularly helpful accommodation provided to EGCs under the Jobs Act's IPO on-ramp is the requirement to provide 2 years of audited financial statements instead of 3 years of statements in its IPO registration statement. However, in certain instances, some companies that have held EGC status have been required to disclose financial statements for periods preceding the earliest period required for disclosure in the company's IPO registration statement. This has occurred occasionally, for example, in the case of acquired company financial statements and for follow-on offerings involving an EGC that lost its EGC status during IPO registration. This bill, Mr. Chairman, clarifies that EGCs do not, under any circumstances, need to provide financial statements that go beyond what the Bipartisan Jobs Act intended. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Not only amendment.
Okay. Hearing none, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Let me just simply congratulate my friend from Florida, a new member of this committee and the majority whip for the Financial Services Committee, for introducing one of his first legislative efforts in the committee, and I'm proud to support H.R. 3343, the Green Lighting Growth Act, and I urge members adopt it, and I yield back the balance of my time. Does anyone else seek recognition? Hearing none, we'll move on to the amendments. Are there amendments to Mr. Herodopoulos' amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, are there any amendments to the ANS? Ranking members recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as a special accommodation for their smaller size and the fact that they have no revenue, emerging growth companies known as EGCs are only obligated to provide 2 years of audited financials when they conduct their initial public offering. Other public companies, on the other hand, are required to provide 3 years of audited financials when they go public. In some situations, however, an EGC must provide 3 years of financials, such as the case where an EGC requires another company or conducts a follow-on offering after its IPO. The bill would clarify this discrepancy by ensuring EGCs only need to provide 2 years, not 3, of audited financials across the board, whether for an IPO, an acquisition, or a follow-on offering. In doing so, Congress is further reducing the burden on EGCs, raising capital by making sure these smaller reporting companies have scaled disclosure obligations in all instances. I urge my colleagues to vote on this bill. Thank you, and I support, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. There being no further discussion or amendments to the gentleman's amendment in the nature of the substitute, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill, H.R. 3343, as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentlewoman from Missouri.
I request a recorded vote.
Gentleman requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move to our next bill under consideration. Pursuant to the notice, I call up H.R. 3357, Enhancing Multi-Class Share Disclosures Act, introduced by the gentleman from Mr. Meeks, the ranking member of our Foreign Affairs Committee. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3357, to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to require issuers with a multi-class stock structure to make certain disclosures in any proxy or consent solicitation material and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from New York has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3357, offered by Mr. Meeks of New York, designated as Meeks 028.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of amendment. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak today in strong support of H.R. 3357, the Enhancing Multi-Class Share Disclosures Act. This common sense bill promotes transparency and accountability in our capital markets, by requiring companies with multi-class share structures to provide clear, consistent disclosures about voting power and control. Multi-class governance structures allow corporate insiders or beneficial owners to hold an outsized amount of voting power relative to their shares. This could limit other investors' abilities to influence management, direct strategy, and hold misaligned boards accountable. Let me be clear. This legislation doesn't prohibit these structures. It simply ensures that companies disclose key information about how voting power is distributed and how long that imbalance will persist. As members of this committee, we have a responsibility to uphold market integrity, and that starts with ensuring investors have access to meaningful, standardized disclosures. When control is concentrated in the hands of a few, investors deserve to know. So I urge my colleagues to support this thoughtful, targeted measure that makes sure that investors have the clearest information that is available to make the best possible decisions. It's a practical step forward, a more transparent and accountable marketplace. And I thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The ranking member of the full committee, Mrs. Waters.
Thank you very much. I move to
Recognized for
strike
5
the
minutes.
last word. Mr. Meeks' bill closes documented gaps around multi-class governance structures. Multi-class governance structures are those where corporate insiders or beneficial owners retain an outsized amount of voting power relative to their shares. These structures, while they may add value, pose significant risk, making transparency ever more important for investors. Specifically, these structures pose significant risk for investors, including limiting investors' abilities to influence management, direct strategy, and hold misaligned boards accountable. Under certain rules, the difference between a corporate insider's voting power and their ownership interests, regardless of how large that gap may be, is often disclosed in ways that are difficult for an ordinary investor to fully comprehend. Accordingly, the SEC Investor Advisory Committee recommended that the Commission amend its rules to ensure that this gap is better defined and quantified for investors via a disclosed ratio. This common sense bill adopts this recommendation to ensure investors have the clearest information available to make the best decision for themselves. This bill is supported by Council of Institutional Investors, whose members manage trillions of working families' assets. I hope to work with Chairman Hill and Mr. Meeks to make some adjustments. We received them from the council that could improve the bill related to how so-called super shares are voted on. These changes would provide more transparency over the power of corporate insiders to control voting outcomes at multi-class companies, better enable retirement savers to fully understand how multi-class structures impact their voting rights, improve transparency around the existing SEC requirements for companies to report their vote tallies on management and shareholders' proposals, be consistent with industry-approved policy, and not be costly for companies to implement because the technology and processes to provide the disclosure currently exist. In the interim, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Does anyone seek recognition? Seeing none, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I support H.R. 3357, the Enhancing Multi-Class Share Disclosures Act introduced by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks. H.R. 3357 takes a balanced approach. It's pursuant to market participant comments submitted to the SEC. And rather restricting multi-class share structures outright, this bill simply enhances disclosure for the benefit of the markets and investors. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back. Does anyone seek recognition? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill H.R. 3357 as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from New York.
ask for a roll call vote.
The gentleman requests a roll call vote. A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, a vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move to our next bill for consideration. Pursuant to notice I call H.R. 3383, the Increasing Investor Opportunities Act, introduced by the gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, the chair of our Capital Markets Subcommittee. The clerk will report to the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3383, to amend the Investment Company Act of 1940 with respect to the authority of closed-end companies to invest in private funds.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentlewoman from Missouri has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. The clerk will report.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3383, offered by Ms. Wagner of Missouri, designated as Wagner 014.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of amendment. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. My bill, H.R. 3383, the Increasing Investor Opportunities Act, would allow closed-end funds to increase their investment in private funds. Approximately 3 million retail investors rely on closed-end funds to save for their retirement. Under current SEC guidance, however, these funds can only invest up to 15% of their net assets into private funds, typically are well off. My bill removes this arbitrary cap while also maintaining the important protections of the Investment Company Act of 1940. Retail investors deserve the opportunity to participate in the types of returns that will have historically been reserved for the wealthy. This bill will do just that. I was also pleased to see the SEC announce earlier this week, Mr. Chairman, that they are reconsidering guidance on private fund investments by closed-end funds. I want to thank, once again, Mr. Meeks for his partnership on this important legislation and so many others that are supporting it on a bipartisan point of view. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Wagner, bill sponsor, yields back. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Like the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
As we consider H.R. 3383, I want to underscore why closed-end funds matter, not just to financial markets, but to millions of Americans planning for their future. Closed-end funds are a vital tool for long-term retail investors, teachers, firefighters, retirees, who rely on steady income and diversified exposure to the markets. These funds are often included in retirement plans that offer access to asset classes that might otherwise be out of reach for everyday investors. Unlike mutual funds, closed-end funds trade on exchanges and can be actively managed for income and long-term growth. But today, they face two serious challenges: predatory activist investors seeking short-term control and outdated SEC limitations that restrict their ability to invest in private funds, despite increasing demand for diversification. By supporting this bill, we are standing up for the long-term investor. We're ensuring CEFs remain accessible, stable, and resilient in a rapidly evolving market. And so I again want to thank Chairwoman Wagner for her leadership on this issue again in this Congress, and I urge my colleagues to join us in protecting this important investment vehicle and supporting H.R. 3383. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition on Mrs. Wagner's ANS? You have an amendment then? You're gonna-
We have an amendment at the desk. You're not going to do the amendment?
Not through yet.
Okay, not yet.
Hearing none on the ANS, I'm proud to support H.R. 3383, the Increasing Investor Opportunities Act, introduced by my good friend, the Capital Markets Subcommittee Chair Wagner. Millions of retail investors rely on closed-end funds as a means of long-term savings and diversification. These funds are professionally managed and subject to rigorous oversight, yet they face an arbitrary restriction on the limits of their ability to access private market investments. Currently, the SEC staff guidance, not a statute or formal rule, limits closed-end funds to investing in no more than 15% of their assets in private funds unless they meet certain narrow conditions, like only offering shares to accredited investors with high minimums. H.R. 3383, in this bill, Mrs. Wagner and Mr. Meeks eliminate this informal cap, allowing closed-end funds to allocate more capital to private investments. I think it's a common sense approach. The bill doesn't change a single fiduciary duty, reporting obligation, or enforcement authority. It just simply removes this opaque staff-level barrier that limits investment choices for everyday Americans. I urge my colleagues to support this straightforward, historically bipartisan reform that gives more investors access to these types of opportunities that have been out of reach. And I yield back. Who seeks recognition? Hearing none, are there amendments to the ANS? For what purposes the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlewoman has an amendment at the desk to Mrs. Wagner's amendment in nature of a substitute. We'll pause while it's distributed.
Mr. Chairman,
Chairman of the subcommittee,
I reserve a point of order.
the gentlewoman reserves a point of order on the Waters Amendment.
Have they distributed the amendment?
Clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3383, offered by Ms. Waters of California, designated as amend H.R. 3383.
Without objection, the amendment's considered read. And the gentlewoman from California is now recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you very much,
5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, not all of the bills before us are truly bipartisan, and the Increasing Investor Opportunities Act is one of those. This bill, as written, would pose meaningful risk to retail investors. Currently, closed-end funds, which are a type of mutual fund, limit their investments into private funds up to 15% of their total holdings. This bill closed-end funds some flexibility to invest in private funds, but establishes a reasonable restriction considering private funds are subject to less regulation and disclosure. This restriction also accounts for the fact that the assets private funds invest in, pledging startups, or distressed companies are significantly more risky than public securities, and most of their investments fail. This bill would eliminate the restriction on closed-end fund investments to buy private funds, allowing them to invest up to 100% of their holdings in private funds. This essentially means we are creating publicity available private equity funds, publicly available private equity funds. And while I agree with Mr. Meeks and others that closed-end funds regulatory framework does offer some protections to retail investors, more protections are needed before we open up what could be a loophole for existing private equity funds to dump their poor performing assets unsuspecting retail investors. The amendment I'm offering now would address some key risks and better protect investors of closed-end funds. This includes investor redemption acts, so closed-end funds can redeem their holdings of private funds easily so as to meet the redemption demands of their own investors. Private funds must also be required to more fairly value their holdings. We now see disturbing trends how private funds conveniently do not update the valuation of their holdings so as to maximize the fees they charge to their own investors. So I ask members to support my amendment to address the risk I have outlined. Until these concerns are addressed, I cannot support the underlying bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Does the gentlewoman from Missouri insist on her point of order?
I withdraw.
Gentlewoman withdraws. Is there further debate on Ms. Waters' amendment? The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I appreciate the gentlewoman's amendment, I'd like to highlight a few concerns that I have. Starting with Section 3, let me just say that an issuer cannot tell or sell to a non-QIB accredited investor on terms that provide that accredited investors with more favorable rights than other investors. This amendment would allow a private company to use QIB securities with favorable terms while disadvantaging the more retail-oriented non-QIB accredited investor. Requiring parity for redemption and resale rights for accredited investors is not practicable, as pension plans, endowments, and other foreign investors have specific requirements that every deal should have a side letter with differing terms. Former SEC Chair Gensler's private fund advisors rule included a restricted activities provision that, among other things, restricted the use of side letters. And as we know, the Fifth Circuit overturned the rule, finding that the SEC overstepped its authority by limiting the ability of private fund advisors and investors to tailor their relationships. Democrats' attempted overreach into the private fund space failed, and this amendment is another roundabout way for the SEC to overstep its authority, Mr. Chairman. Then regarding Section 4, this amendment would significantly impact fund operations by requiring them to adhere to Rule 2A-5, valuation policies, unless the fund is exclusively open to QIBs. The amendment's impact is substantial as it moves private fund valuation closer to the requirements for registered investment companies. This amendment runs counter to the capital formation objectives pursued by the underlying measure, which is solely focused on enhancing safe private market access through closed-end funds. I would urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition on Mrs. Waters' amendment? If there's no further debate, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Waters. All those in favor of the amendment shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The nays have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
I seek recognition.
The gentlewoman. A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. Further proceedings on this amendment are postponed. Are there further amendments to Mrs. Wagner's amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, we'll go to we will now move to the next bill for consideration. It's H.R. 3301, a bill to amend the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934 to specify certain registration contents for emerging growth companies, to permit issuers to file draft registration statements with the Securities and Exchange Commission for confidential review. It's introduced by the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3301, to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to specify certain registration statement contents for emerging growth companies, to permit issuers to file draft registration statements with the Securities and Exchange Commission for confidential review and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from Iowa has the amendment in a nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3301, offered by Mr. Nunn of Iowa, designated as Nunn 073.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of amendment. The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Waters. I am proud to champion this bipartisan bill, the Encouraging Local Emerging Ventures and Economic Growth Act, or the Elevate Act. Let me start by saying what we all know to be true. America's capital markets are the envy of the world. Part of that strength comes from the bipartisan work of every committee, particularly this committee with the passage of the Jobs Act just over a decade ago. One of the biggest successes from that law was the creation of a new category of companies known as the Emerging Growth Companies, or EGCs. This new category was established to encourage smaller companies, like those from my home state of Iowa, to go public, and go public right here in America. In the first 4 years, we saw a quick change. EGCs accounted for 86% of all initial public offerings. That means smaller companies, innovative companies, were able to go public because they had the capital to grow and be successful. The Jobs Act didn't just expand opportunities, it created jobs. It generated an estimated 82. But despite our economic strength, too many small and mid-sized businesses across our country, particularly in places like the heart of the heartland in Iowa, are still facing roadblocks, burdensome red tape when they try to raise and grow investment, challenges in dealing with what happens on the coast, and a limited opportunity for them to gain the same type of capital access that others have found. My hometown Main Street job creators regularly tell me they want to expand, build new facilities, hire more people, and give back to our communities. But they need greater access to capital. Mr. Chair, just imagine the economic momentum we could unleash if it made it easier for those businesses to connect with investors and bring new investments right to Middle America, and candidly, across our entire country, so that we could have capital that helps create new innovation right here in the United States. And that's why I've introduced the Elevate Act. This bill is a simple, common sense fix that helps level the playing field for growing businesses. The Elevate Act allows spin-offs of EGCs to submit draft filings to the SEC confidentially and lowers the reporting requirements, slashing the red tape to only 2 years of financial data. This important change standardizes the rules for these companies. It eliminates unnecessary paperwork, lowers the cost of going public, and gives businesses more room to grow, innovate, and ultimately create jobs for all of us. The EGC financial statement accommodations should apply equally whether a company is conducting an IPO or spinning off a segment of its business and taking that company public. We know the Jobs Act worked, Mr. Chair. Now we have a chance to continue to build on that success. By passing the Elevate Act, we can make it easier for Main Street businesses, not just Wall Street, to have access to the capital they need. I also want to thank my bipartisan member on this, Representative Janelle Benham. Working with me across the aisle, we've been able to ensure that every American is going to have the opportunity at success for their business, for their hometown, and for the future of job creation. With that, I thank both sides of the aisle, and Mr. Chair, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The Chair of the Capital Markets Committee, Ms. Wagner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. And I'd like to thank the gentleman from Iowa for introducing this bill that gives parity to a spinoff of an emerging growth company to that of an IPO when it comes to the 2-year financial statement requirements. By equalizing the requirements of an IPO and a spinoff, this bill will reduce compliance costs without sacrificing investor protections. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The ranking member, full committee, Ms. Waters, recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Emerging growth companies, or EGCs, are a type of public company that we created in the Bipartisan Jobs Act. These EGCs only need to provide 2 years of audited financials when they conduct their initial public offerings or IPOs. Despite this special 2-year accommodation, there are some instances where an EGC is still required to provide 3 years of financials. One such instance is when EGC conducts a spinoff, which is a transaction in which one company creates a new independent company by selling new shares of its existing business. Mr. Nunn's bill reduces this obligation for EGC spinoffs to 2 years, keeping it in line with what is required when the EGC itself goes public. In doing so, the bill streamlines the financial disclosure obligations for EGCs across the board, making it easier for them to raise capital from the public. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this important bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Hearing none, we'll move into amendments. Are there amendments to Mr. Nunn's bill in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall be signified by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill, H.R. 3301, as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall be signified by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from, gentlewoman?
I request a recorded vote.
Gentleman from Missouri requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. A vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move to consideration of our next measure. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 3339, Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act of 2025, introduced by the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3339, to require certification exemptions for accredited investors and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from Nebraska has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. Clerk will report.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3339, offered by Mr. Flood of Nebraska, designated as Flood 014.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of an amendment. I recognize the gentlewoman from Missouri, the chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, for 5 minutes to explain Mr. Flood's amendment.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, for introducing this bipartisan piece of legislation. The Equal Opportunity for All Investor Act creates a new pathway for knowledgeable, experienced, and sophisticated investors to participate in the economic growth of our private markets. This bill also gives businesses that are seeking to raise capital greater access to a critical source of funding. Using wealth as a proxy for determining an investor's level of sophistication excludes a large pool of investors who have the knowledge to make informed decisions about where they want to invest. By expanding the accredited investor definition for individuals who have been historically relegated to the investing sidelines. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, recognized.
I move to the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, in both this Congress and last, I've been particularly outspoken about the risk of retail investors investing in private securities. Among other things, private securities lack sufficient transparency, have longer lockup periods, are much more volatile, and are less liquidity than their public counterparts. It is critical that anyone who invests in these risky assets has sufficient knowledge of those risks. Currently, companies or brokers they hire can only solicit these, quote, investment opportunities, quote unquote, to individuals who have been deemed to be accredited investors. This definition is currently based on a person's income and net worth, meaning only those making a certain amount of money or possessing a big enough bank account to have access to them. But anyone can tell you that just because you have a lot of money doesn't make you knowledgeable about the markets. Knowledgeable, or knowledge, is the key here. And the definition needs to be revising or revisiting to center around this core concept of knowledge and expertise. The committee has heard from some investors who want to invest their own money in some of these risky and illiquid investments and don't want to be barred from investing just because they don't meet the wealth or income test. The Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act addresses this problem by allowing an individual to qualify as an accredited investor if they pass an exam that ensures they are properly versed in the risk of investing in private markets. With this change, ordinary investors who want to invest in private securities can now do so, assuming they pass the test, which would establish they were keenly aware of the particular risk related to high-risk and illiquid securities and conflicts of interest presented when financial professionals sell their products to investors. Last year, I worked with Mr. McHenry and Mr. Flood to ensure that this test contains specific robust elements that the Republican witnesses at previous hearings talked about when discussing how they teach and mentor their budding investors. So I'm pleased that the Republicans agreed to make the test available free of charge to anyone who's willing, able to go through this rigor. Mr. Chairman and members, I finally want to thank Mr. Flood for working with me on a bill that ensures that the SEC is appropriately overseeing this exam process. And let me just raise this question. Is this in existence in addition to the other bill that we had that changed the definition? This adds to a new definition or more information. How do these two bills complement each other?
Would the gentlewoman yield?
I yield to.
I'll give you my informed view as a member of Congress that's not an expert in these things, but I would say the following, that were one to adopt my definitional issue, that if you have professional qualifications, you're able to be an accredited investor. This would facilitate people who don't have professional qualifications but seek to do the education to take the exam and be satisfied by the exam would allow them then to serve or be considered as an accredited investor. So I think they're complementary. This would expand it broader because of the people who would take the test and be qualified by virtue of the test.
Oh, well, thank you, because I thought that your bill only referred to those who were somewhat involved.
That's right.
And have knowledge.
It does. That's why I believe this bill is complementary, because the bill I offer today that we've advanced to the House says that if you have specific qualifications, you're a medical doctor and you're looking at a medical, or if you're an investor, you're looking at an investment, you have that professional accredited investor exemption, if you want to think of it, or qualification. This would allow ordinary Americans to study and prepare themselves and take a test. And if they're able to pass that test, they could be considered accredited investors. Does that answer the gentleman's
That
question?
does, it answered my question, thank you.
The gentleman yields back. In order to get more information about just what Mr. Flood's bill done, let's turn to the author of the bill, who's worked very hard on this with former Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Waters, in the last Congress, and now in this Congress. I yield Mr. Flood 5 minutes.
Motion to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act of 2025 is an important step towards providing more opportunities to a larger slice of the American investing public. I'd like to thank Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, and my Democratic co-lead, Cleo Fields, for their support. This bill would expand the accredited investor definition to include individuals that are certified through an exam written by the SEC. Individual to be an accredited investor, you must meet one of the following requirements. Number one, you must have an annual income of greater than $200,000 for the last 2 years, with the expectation of earning the same or more in the current year. Number two, you must have a net worth exceeding $1 million, and this amount cannot include a primary residence. And number three, you must be a general partner, executive officer, or director of a company issuing unregistered securities. In 2020, another pathway to becoming an accredited investor was created. An individual with professional credentials demonstrating their knowledge of markets, like a Series 65 or a Series 7, could become accredited investors. The change to the accredited investor definition in 2020 was long overdue. Imagine a world where an investment advisor can tell their clients what private offerings they should pursue, but is somehow unable to make those same investment choices with their own money. That simply doesn't make any sense, and I think the example reveals a greater truth around the accredited investor definition. Wealth is not a particularly strong judge of whether someone should be an accredited investor or not. A better one is whether someone has the knowledge to accurately weigh the benefits and risks of private offerings. Investment professionals are an obvious example of a group that can be expected to properly weigh those risks. It's their job. That brings me back to this bill. The Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act takes the accredited investor definition to its next natural step. If we believe that knowledge, not just wealth, are sufficient to make an individual an accredited investor, why not more directly test the knowledge of potential accredited investors? This bill would direct the SEC to create an accredited investor exam that will be thorough and extensively test an investor's sophistication and knowledge of the risks of private offerings. This bill includes a long list of parameters to be included in the exam. All of them are intended to ensure investors understand the differences between private and public offerings and some of the potential risks that could emerge from those differences. This bill strikes an effective balance. It brings more investors into the accredited investor pool, but contains guardrails that would filter out individuals that do not fully understand private offerings and the investment risk associated with them. I am proud of this bipartisan bill, which was the product of a robust discussion with our colleagues across the aisle. We have legislation today that would make for a tough but fair exam for investors that want to become accredited investors. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Hearing none, we'll move on to amendments. Are there many amendments to Mr. Flood's bill? There being no discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill H.R. 3339 as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlewoman,
I request a recorded vote.
a recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hands. Sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. A vote on this question is postponed. Before we move on to the next bill, I want to call up H.R. 3383. There being no further amendments without objection, the previous question on the substitute is ordered and recorded votes or pending amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the question and report the measure. Pursuant to the notice, I call up H.R. 1190, the Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act, introduced by the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Downing. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 1190 to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to expand access to capital for rural area small businesses and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from Montana has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. Clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1190, offered by Mr. Downing of Montana, designated as Down in 032.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of amendment. The gentleman from Montana, Mr. Downing, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Small businesses are the lifeblood of the United States economy. Over 99.9% of businesses across the country are classified as small businesses, employing nearly half of all Americans. The job impacts of small businesses are even greater in Montana, which employ 67% of Montanans, according to the Small Business Administration. The number one barrier to expansion for any business, especially small businesses, is access to capital. Through my own experiences, I know how difficult it can be for these businesses to secure the funding they need to grow. When I first started out in the tech industry, trying to find capital for that was nearly impossible, trying to scrape that together. I've been in manufacturing businesses, got a garment manufacturing business, I've got a distillery, built a real estate business, and all of these, access to capital was the primary driver in being able to be successful. Now, around 1 in 5 Americans live in rural areas. According to the Center on Rural Innovation, 12% of U.S. businesses are located within these rural areas, yet they receive less than 1% of venture capital funding. And Montana's 2nd Congressional District, which I'm proud to represent, is very rural. In fact, multiple counties that I represent have populations under 500 people. It's these overlooked people and places that have inspired my legislation, H.R. 1190, the Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act. So my bill requires the SEC's advocate for small business capital formation to identify and report to Congress the challenges that rural small businesses face when trying to access our capital markets. This would make it easier for members of Congress to do our jobs to make sure rural small businesses like those in Montana are not left behind. I want to thank my colleague from Oregon, Ms. Bynum, for joining me in this effort, and I'm happy to see this committee advance so many sensible proposals to increase access to capital today, many of which are bipartisan. So I urge my colleagues to support this common sense legislation, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Montana yields back. Who seeks recognition? Mrs. Wagner from Missouri,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
recognized for 5 minutes.
I support Mr. Downing's legislation, H.R. 1190, the Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act. Too often, conversations about capital formation focus on Silicon Valley and Wall Street, leaving out the small manufacturers, farmers, and family-run enterprises that power rural economies across our country. These businesses face real structural barriers when it comes to raising capital, and barriers that look different than those in major urban markets. What this bill does is straightforward but essential. It ensures that the SEC's advocate for small business capital formation doesn't treat rural as an afterthought. It makes rural entrepreneurs a formal part of the SEC's mandate, so that their colleagues and so that their challenges are not only heard, but studied, understood, and addressed. This legislation ensures the federal government starts asking the right questions about how we close funding gaps in a way that's tailored to rural communities. It is a targeted, bipartisan fix that ensures that rural voices are at the table when capital formation policy is shaped. I urge my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, to support this bill, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The gentlewoman, the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters.
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I strongly support this legislation, which would require the SEC's Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation to report on capital access issues faced by small rural businesses. Currently, the Advocate reports on small businesses that are minority-owned, women-owned, and disaster-stricken, but at present does not cover businesses in rural areas. This bill simply adds rural small businesses to the list of covered entities that the office will report on. Small businesses, no matter where they are located or who they are owned by, are the backbone of the American economy. Lawmakers and regulators should be doing everything they can to support them. I urge all members to support this bill.
Gentlewoman yields back.
Move back.
Seeks recognition. Hearing none, let me recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to support this good work by two of our new members on the Financial Services Committee, Ms. Bynum, and working in conjunction with the bill sponsor, Mr. Downing. I want to commend them as brand-new members of the committee in the 119th Congress for working together for such a good, solid, common-sense purpose. H.R. 1190 will break down one of the continued burdens that we have, which is expanding access to capital, particularly in rural America. And Mr. Downing has outstanding entrepreneur background, firsthand experience in how challenging it can be for angel investors, organized venture capitalists, for entrepreneurs all to be connected and matched up, and we're delighted that he represents the mountain states of our country on this committee. Once again, this would urge the advocate in the SEC and require them to prioritize reaching out to small businesses and identifying unique barriers in rural areas on accessing capital. So I commend Mr. Downing and Ms. Bynum working together on this bill. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any other amendments? If there are no other people seeking recognition, we'll consider amendments. Are there any amendments to Mr. Downing's A&S? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed signify by saying nay. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Question now occurs on ordering the bill H.R. 1190 as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlewoman from Missouri.
I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman requests a recorded vote. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hands. Sufficient number having raised their hand. A recorded vote is ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. A vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move to consideration of the next measure. Pursuant to notice I call of H.R. 3352, Helping Angels Lead Our Startups, the HALOS Act of 2025, introduced by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3352, to require the Securities and Exchange Commission to revise rules relating to general solicitation or general advertising to allow for presentations or other communication made by or on behalf of an issuer at certain events and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from New York has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3352, offered by Mr. Lawler of New York, designated as Lawler 054.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for the purposes of amendment. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, is recognized to explain his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For several years, small businesses have been weathering turbulent economic times, having survived COVID They contended with burdensome regulations and high inflation, which have stifled economic growth, held back entrepreneurs, and frankly made it harder for everyday Americans to pursue their American dream. According to the Small Business Administration, small businesses, defined as firms with fewer than 500 employees, accounted for approximately 43.5% of U.S. GDP. These businesses also created over 70% of net new jobs since 2019, with the U.S. averaging 430,000 new business applications per month in 2024, a 50% increase from 2019. We should be doing everything we can to promote investment, foster entrepreneurship, and spur on small business growth, whether it's reforming outdated policy or making it easier to access capital, which is why I asked my colleagues to support my Helping Angels Lead Our Startups Act, otherwise known as the HALOS Act. The HALOS Act promotes access to investment capital for small companies and ensures that startups can continue to generate interest and connect with investors. The bill defines an angel investor and clarifies the definition of general solicitation to ensure that startups have the opportunity and ability to discuss their products and business plans at certain events known as demo days. In doing so, companies will be able to engage with a wider audience of investors and spread the word about the products and services that they offer to help develop a thriving and diverse economy. Barriers like the general compliance requirements on general solicitations can reduce opportunities for small businesses, entrepreneurs, and everyday investors as they both soak up the amount of time and resources needed, but also deter small businesses who are afraid of unintentionally violating these laws. We have seen many successes since the passing of the Bipartisan Jobs Act over a decade ago, which helped reduce barriers to investment. The HALOS Act is the logical next step on the road of clarifying and modernizing rules that will enable startups to find the resources they need to grow and thrive. Every year, angel investors support tens of thousands of small businesses, and their long-term impact is undeniable. Household names like Amazon, Costco, Facebook, Google, and Starbucks all started with the backing of angel investors. By facilitating angel investment, we are working towards a stronger, more dynamic economy, lifting entrepreneurs of all ages and ensuring they have access to the early capital they require. When we cut red tape, ease the burden on businesses, and make it cheaper and simpler for growing companies to raise capital, we're not just helping businesses expand, we're opening doors. And that means more opportunities for underrepresented entrepreneurs and communities that have historically faced barriers to funding. The HALOS Act allows folks to get eyes on their business and find a vital potential investor their business needs to succeed. So I'm glad that we were able to make a revision to alleviate some of the concerns posed by the ranking member. I'd like to thank her, as well as my Democratic colleague, Congressman Josh Gottheimer, for co-leading this vital piece of legislation. And I want to thank Chairman Hill and Chairwoman Wagner for making sure that this bill was part of the markup today. I urge all of you to support this pragmatic measure to help our small businesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Let me call on the ranking member, I beg your pardon, let me call on the chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I support H.R. 3352, the Helping Angels Lead Our Startups HALOS Act, and I thank Congressman Lawler for his leadership on this issue. In communities across the country, innovation doesn't just happen on stock exchanges. It starts in tech incubators, co-working spaces, and university labs. But too often, promising startups hit a wall early because they are limited in ways to engage with potential investors without triggering complex securities law. This bill provides clarity around what qualifies as a general solicitation and ensures that legitimate demo day events where entrepreneurs present their ideas to investors don't get caught up in red tape. The goal here is not to deregulate, is to make sure that our rules distinguish between a formal securities offering and a simple conversation about a business idea. If we want to foster entrepreneurship, we need to ensure our regulations support the early stages of capital formation. H.R. 3352 gives small startups and investors confidence that participating in a demo day won't accidentally violate federal securities law.
Next week.
I urge my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, to support this bipartisan pro-growth bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters,
I move to strike the last word.
recognized for 5 minutes.
This bill does two things. First, it allows startups to discuss their products and business plans at certain events known as demo days, without such discussions counting as a general solicitation under the securities regulation, and therefore as an investment offering necessitating SEC registration. Second, it defines what an angel investor is for purposes of securities laws. Angel investors are simply well-off individuals that invest money into startups. Unlike prior iterations of this bill, the current bill prohibits demo days from taking place at facilities owned by religious institutions and allows both Native American tribes and startup incubators to host them. I've personally seen bad actors taking advantage of churches in Los Angeles, and it has devastated their congregations. I'm pleased Mr. Lawler agreed to remove churches and other religious institutions from his bill. The bill also maintains SEC's ability to set additional guardrails to ensure companies or their investors don't misuse the opportunity to speak with potential investors. These changes sufficiently address concerns I had, and I'm pleased to recommend a yes vote on H.R. 3352. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Seeing no other members seeking recognition, I recognize myself for 5 minutes in support of Mr. Lawler's bill, H.R. 3352, the HALOS Act. Mr. Lawler, what I like about this bill is that it's building on the theme from our decade of work from the original Jobs Act in trying to enhance the venture ecosystem, and implementing this bipartisan effort included the concept of demo days, communications, made an event sponsored by a group or entity that invites investors to present their businesses, the potential as a general solicitation. Classifying these communications as general solicitation limited the regulatory pathways a company could choose from raising money, as it's certainly offering exemptions to prohibit the use of general solicitation. This bill clarifies that, and I think it is a real benefit, as Chairwoman Wagner pointed out. When I travel and visit my innovation hubs, my venture co-working spaces, my startup junkie locations or university campuses, this will be a big component of encouraging angel investor groups to have access to this sort of work. So H.R. 3355 includes how this works and clarifies it, and I support it fully, and I yield back the balance of my time. Does anybody else seek recognition? If there are no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed will signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill H.R. 3352 as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay.
Chairman.
Chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from New York.
A recorded vote.
Gentleman from New York requests a recorded vote. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3, the committee rules, a vote on this question is postponed. We'll now move to the next bill under consideration, which is H.R. 3348, the Accredited Investor Definition Review Act, introduced by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Heisinger, who's the vice chairman of the full committee. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3348, to amend the Securities Act of 1933 and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act with respect to the definition of accredited investor and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from Michigan has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. The clerk will report his amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3348 offered by Mr. Huizinga of Michigan, designated as Heisen 020.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read, and this will serve as the base test for purposes of amendment. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Small businesses, entrepreneurs, emerging companies are what drive the American economy, and we meet them in our districts every day. We hear their stories. We see firsthand the benefits that their dreams, their innovations, and hard work provide to our constituents, our communities, their neighbors. Last year, as part of the committee's capital formation agenda, we heard from everyday Americans who, despite the odds, succeeded in achieving their dreams. Under current securities laws, accredited investors are allowed to purchase securities that haven't been registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. These types of offerings carry more risk than public offerings, and in theory, individuals with enough financial sophistication or net worth, which I have to editorialize, are two very different things. Just because you're rich does not mean you actually have financial sophistication. But nonetheless, that's the definition that we're dealing with. These are individuals with enough financial sophistication or net worth. They can bear the potential losses that may be associated with these types of securities. Simply put, accredited investors are currently defined by the SEC based on their income and their net worth, not whether they can actually understand financial markets or have demonstrated greater sophistication or expertise or understand the risk. My bill, the Accredited Investor Definition Review Act, would require the SEC to incorporate additional, quote, certifications, designations, or credentials that further the purpose of the accredited investor definition, close quote, within 18 months, and thereafter assess the addition of certifications, designations, or credentials every 5 years. In 2024, the SEC's updated the definition of an accredited investor, but it failed to update the pre-existing financial thresholds. Without congressional action, innovators who often turn to their own local communities will be unable to reach those investors who can make a huge impact for them. As we've heard today, the current definition the SEC uses to identify accredited investors is outdated. Today, that definition is solely based on wealth. The ability to participate in a private offering should not be limited to individuals that pass some type of federal government assets test. Instead, the ability to participate should be expanded to include all individuals that demonstrate that they have a sufficient understanding of that offering. Mr. Chairman, last Congress, this bill passed with a broad bipartisan support in both this committee and then on the House floor. And actually, I would note that it passed 41-2 out of our committee. I think we can all agree that we need to open our capital markets and our financial system to more people, not less. Let's offer more opportunity. So I urge my colleagues to once again support this legislation, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, who seeks recognition and support of Mr. Huizinga's amendment. Ms. Wagner, the chair of the Capital Markets Committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I want to thank the gentleman from Michigan for his leadership on this bill, which would provide more everyday investors with opportunities to save and build wealth. The accredited investor definition creates inequality in our securities law by restricting investments in the private market, where returns are often the highest, to only those who are already well off. This bill takes a major step towards expanding the current accredited investor definition by requiring the SEC to review the list of certifications, designations, and credentials for qualifying as an accredited investor. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back who seeks recognition. The ranking member of the full committee, Mrs. Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Well, we're not ready for amendments yet. Let me ask the gentlewoman to hold on that just for a moment. Anybody else seek recognition on the Mr. Heisinger's amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, let me recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank the gentleman from Michigan, our vice chairman of the full committee, for offering his additional thoughtful proposal to increase qualified accredited investors across our country. We want to continue, as I said a few minutes ago, to build the venture ecosystem and make sure that more Americans have the opportunity to invest in those private opportunities that exist, but we also want to make sure that that's done in the right way, in a thoughtful way that enhances expertise. HR 3348 ensures the definition of an accredited investor keeps pace with modern financial literacy and professional expertise. So I thank him for his bill. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time. Does anyone else seek recognition? Hearing none, we'll move to amendments. Are there amendments to the gentleman's bill? Ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you, and I do have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlewoman will pause, and she has an amendment at the desk. We'll let that be distributed.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to raise a point of order.
The gentleman from Michigan reserves a point of order. Okay. You're going to call votes. I think we'll finish this. Gentleman from Michigan reserved a point of order. Clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3348, offered by Ms. Waters of California, designated as amend H.R. 3348-1.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read, and the gentlewoman, the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Heisinger's Accredited Investor Definition Review Act would give broad discretion to the SEC to redefine, quote, an accredited investor, quote, unquote. As I spoke to earlier regarding Mr. Hill's accredited investor bill, which I support, the accredited investor framework, which is being changed by this and other bills today, has long protected the general public from being sold high-risk, illiquid private securities. Unlike in our public capital markets, the private capital markets companies do not provide anywhere near the same financial and other disclosures to investors, and there are not the same legal protections for investors either, nor is there the same ability of the SEC or the state securities regulators to police these markets. But the SEC under Trump is not the SEC I know. President Trump has asserted stunning and unlawful control over executive agencies and commissions since taking office, including the SEC. He sent his billionaire co-president, Elon Musk, and his so-called Department of Government Efficiency into the building to gut the agency, and Trump's budget office has inserted its control over all of SEC's rulemaking going forward, and most alarmingly and clearly in violation of the law. Trump has fired independent commissioners at other agencies like the National Credit Union Administration and the FTC, which also serves as a threat to SEC's commissioners. As the lone Democratic SEC commissioner, Caroline Crenshaw, warned recently, the SEC under Trump is abandoning